A storm and a stranger. The storm raged with a fury unmatched, each crash of thunder shaking the small town to its very bones. Sheets of rain pelted against the windows of Daniel Carter's modest countryside home, creating a rhythmic cacophony that drowned out the ticking of the old grandfather clock in his living room. The once white curtains swayed gently from the cold drafts sneaking in through the old wooden frame of the window. Daniel sat in his favorite chair, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of the night. At 53, Daniel had a life written in the creases of his face, a story of triumph, loss, and quiet resilience. His short-cropped hair and military posture still hinted at his years in the service, but the solemn gaze in his eyes told of battles fought both abroad and within himself. Retirement from the military had brought its own set of challenges, leaving him isolated in a world that moved on without him. The storm outside mirrored his own restlessness. As a particularly loud crack of thunder reverberated through the house, he found himself tensing instinctively. Memories of other storms, ones accompanied by the roar of engines and the flash of artillery, rose unbidden to the surface. He exhaled slowly, counting to 10, a grounding technique his therapist had taught him years ago. Slowly, the grip of the past loosened its hold. Then came the knock. It was sharp and unexpected, slicing through the storm's chaos like a knife. Daniel froze, his body taut with caution. Who would venture out on such a night, and why to his doorstep? Setting the mug down, he moved cautiously to the door, his mind running through the possibilities. A stranded motorist, perhaps, or someone lost in the storm. Peering through the peephole, he saw little more than a hunched figure, illuminated briefly by the flickering porch light. His military instincts screamed for caution, but his humanity whispered otherwise. Slowly, he unlocked the door and opened it, his other hand gripping the edge tightly. Standing there was a woman, her clothes drenched and clinging to her frail frame. Her face was obscured by a mess of wet hair, but her trembling lips and pale complexion spoke volumes. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I just need shelter from the storm. I'll stay on the porch if I have to. Just please." Daniel hesitated for only a moment, his heart and mind waging a silent war. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning her in. "Come inside. You'll catch your death out here." The woman's expression shifted from desperation to relief as she shuffled inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her immediately, though her shivers persisted. Daniel shut the door firmly behind her, locking out the storm once more. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You have no idea." Daniel nodded, his posture stiff as he assessed her appearance. She was in her late 40s, perhaps early 50s, though the weariness in her face made her seem older. Her clothes were of decent quality, though soaked and fraying at the edges. She carried no bag, no belongings, just the heavy burden of someone who had endured far too much for far too long. "Let me grab you a towel," Daniel said, disappearing briefly into a nearby closet. He returned and handed her a clean, fluffy towel. "Dry off. Bathrooms down the hall if you need it." She took the towel gratefully, her trembling hands betraying her exhaustion. I don't want to impose. I'll leave once the storm passes. Thank you for letting me in." "Don't worry about it," Daniel replied, his tone gruff but not unkind. "You're here now. Just take a moment to warm up." He watched as she dried her face and hands, her movements slow and deliberate. Her breathing began to steady, though her shoulders remained hunched as if bracing for an inevitable blow. "What's your name?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "Leah," she replied after a brief hesitation. "Leah Morgan." "Daniel Carter," he said, extending a hand. She hesitated but shook it lightly. Her grip was weak, a testament to her drained strength. "What brings you out on a night like this, Leah?" Her eyes darted away, focusing on the floor. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been moving from place to place. Tonight, I just got caught in the storm." Daniel frowned but chose not to press further. He had seen enough in his life to recognize a person guarding their story. "Wait here," he said, disappearing down the hall once more. He returned with a pair of sweatpants and an oversized sweatshirt. "These will be too big, but they're dry." Leah nodded, clutching the clothes to her chest as though they were a lifeline. "Thank you." "Bathroom's still down the hall," he added, motioning towards it. "Take your time." As she disappeared behind the bathroom door, Daniel exhaled deeply, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. This was far from his usual routine, and he couldn't shake the unease simmering beneath the surface. But as much as his instincts urged caution, his empathy wouldn't allow him to turn her away. In the kitchen, he busied himself with making a fresh pot of coffee and warming up some soup he had in the fridge. It was a small act, but one that helped him focus amidst the uncertainty. By the time Leah returned, dressed in his oversized clothes, her face looked cleaner, her hair neatly combed. Though still pale and tired, she seemed more at ease. "Sit," Daniel said, gesturing to the small dining table. "Soup's almost ready." Leah hesitated before taking a seat. "You really don't have to go through all this trouble." "It's not trouble," he replied curtly, setting a steaming bowl in front of her. "Eat." The first spoonful seemed to break something within her, a wall of tension she had been holding up. Tears welled in her eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. "I'm sorry," she murmured. It's been so long since someone." Daniel sat across from her, his expression softening. "Take your time." And so she did, eating slowly and silently as the storm raged on outside. As the minutes turned into hours, Daniel began to realize that Leah Morgan was far more than just a stranger caught in a storm. There was a depth to her story, a weight to her presence, that stirred something long dormant within him. And though he didn't know it yet, her arrival would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted. The weight of stories. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden after the storm had finally spent its fury. The once howling winds had given way to the gentle chirping of birds, and the rhythmic drumming of rain was replaced by the occasional plop of droplets falling from leaves. Inside Daniel Carter's home, the stillness felt fragile, like the calm after a long and harrowing battle. Daniel stood at the stove, his movements measured as he flipped pancakes on a griddle. The rich aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the smell of cooking batter, filling the small kitchen with warmth. It was a ritual he hadn't indulged in for years, one he reserved for rare occasions when he felt like treating himself. Today, however, it wasn't just for him. He glanced over his shoulder toward the couch, where Leah Morgan lay sleeping, wrapped in the thick blankets he had provided the night before. Her frail figure seemed even smaller under the layers, her face peaceful for the first time since she had appeared on his doorstep. The lines of exhaustion that had been etched so deeply into her features had softened in sleep, and Daniel found himself wondering what stories lay hidden behind them. As the pancakes piled up on a plate, he couldn't help but think back to the previous night. Her words, halting and carefully chosen, had been sparse, but they hinted at a life unraveled. Daniel was no stranger to unraveling. He had spent the better part of a decade stitching together the fragments of his own shattered life. Perhaps that was why he hadn't hesitated to let her in, despite the voice of caution that had whispered otherwise. The faint rustle of blankets drew his attention. Leah stirred, her eyes fluttering open as she slowly adjusted to her surroundings. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by the cautious recognition of where she was. "Good morning," Daniel said, his gruff voice breaking the silence. Leah sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders as if it were a shield. "Morning," she replied, her voice still thick with sleep. "I made breakfast," he said simply, setting the plate of pancakes and a mug of coffee on the table. "Figured you could use a good meal." Leah hesitated, as though the act of accepting a kindness was unfamiliar territory. Finally, she rose and approached the table, sitting gingerly in one of the chairs. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They ate in relative silence, broken only by the clink of utensils and the occasional sip of coffee. Daniel wasn't one for small talk, and Leah seemed reluctant to offer anything unprompted. But as the minutes stretched on, he found the silence less awkward and more companionable. "So," Daniel began, breaking the quiet, "what's your story?" Leah paused mid-bite, her fork hovering over her plate. Her gaze dropped, and her fingers tightened around the handle of her mug. "It's complicated," she said finally. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "I got time." Leah exhaled, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her unspoken words was too much to bear. "I used to have a life," she began, her voice tinged with both bitterness and sorrow. "A good one, I thought. I owned a small bakery in the city, a place people came to not just for the bread and pastries, but for the sense of community. It was my pride and joy." Her lips curved into a faint, wistful smile as she spoke, but it quickly faded. Then one thing after another went wrong. "My husband," she paused, swallowing hard. "He passed away suddenly. Heart attack. I didn't even have time to prepare." Daniel's expression softened, his own memories of loss stirring uncomfortably. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Leah nodded, acknowledging his sympathy but pressing on. "Losing him, it was like the ground disappeared beneath me. I tried to keep the bakery going, but grief clouded my judgment. Bills piled up, repairs I couldn't afford. And when the pandemic hit a couple of years ago," she shook her head, "it was the final blow. I lost the business, the house, everything." The words came out flat, as though she had rehearsed them 100 times, yet the pain beneath them was raw and undeniable. "I've been moving from place to place ever since," she continued, "trying to find work, trying to stay afloat. But once you fall far enough, it feels impossible to climb back up." Daniel listened intently, his chest tightening with a mix of empathy and anger at a world that could be so unforgiving. "You've been alone this whole time?" he asked. Leah nodded. "Friends disappeared when things got hard. Family. I didn't have much to begin with. And the shelters." Her voice trailed off, a shadow passing over her face. "Let's just say they aren't always safe places." Daniel understood the unspoken truth behind her words. He had heard similar stories from veterans who had come through the center where he volunteered. The world could be a brutal place for those who had fallen through the cracks. "Why here?" he asked after a moment. "Why my doorstep?" Leah hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "I was walking, trying to find some kind of shelter before the storm hit. I saw the light in your window and, I don't know, something about it felt safe." Safe. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with significance. Daniel wasn't sure he deserved such a label. His own struggles with anger and isolation often made him feel anything but safe, but he couldn't deny that her presence stirred a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "You're welcome to stay," he said finally, "at least until you figure out your next steps." Leah's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Don't worry about it," Daniel replied, his tone gruff but kind. "Just take it one day at a time." That afternoon, Daniel drove Leah to the small veterans center where he volunteered every Saturday. It wasn't much, a converted community hall with mismatched furniture and peeling paint, but it was a place where people came together to find support and camaraderie. Daniel figured it might be good for Leah to see she wasn't alone in her struggles. The moment they walked through the doors, Daniel was greeted with familiar nods and smiles from the regulars. Leah, however, hesitated by the entrance, her posture stiff and uncertain. "Come on," Daniel said, gently guiding her forward. "I'll introduce you." As the day unfolded, Leah found herself slowly drawn into the rhythm of the center. She helped serve lunch, sorted donations, and even sat down to chat with some of the veterans who shared their own stories of hardship and resilience. Though she was quiet at first, Her natural warmth began to shine through. And by the end of the day, she was laughing softly at a joke told by one of the older volunteers. On the drive home, Leah was uncharacteristically quiet, staring out the window as the countryside rolled by. Finally, she spoke. "Thank you, Daniel. For today. For everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't opened that door." Daniel glanced at her, his hand steady on the wheel. "Sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to listen," he said simply. "You've got more strength than you realize, Leah. Don't forget that." As they pulled into the driveway, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in what felt like years, Leah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Building bridges. Leah woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of clinking dishes. For a moment, she lay still, allowing herself the rare luxury of feeling safe. The last few days in Daniel's home had been a whirlwind, a storm of kindness after years of solitude. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept through the night without waking in fear of her surroundings or the cold creeping into her bones. Throwing off the blanket, Leah stretched and made her way to the kitchen. Daniel was at the counter, his back to her, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. His movements were precise, efficient, the habits of a man accustomed to routine. "Morning," he said gruffly without turning around. "Good morning," Leah replied, her voice soft. She hesitated near the door, feeling like an intruder despite his continued hospitality. Daniel set the mugs on the table, motioning for her to sit. "Coffee's hot. I figured you might want some before we figure out the plan for today." Leah nodded, taking the seat across from him. The warmth of the mug in her hands was a small comfort, grounding her in the present. "Plan?" she asked cautiously. "You can't stay in limbo forever," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "You need a direction, something to aim for." The bluntness of his words stung, but Leah knew he wasn't wrong. Surviving day to day had consumed her for so long that the idea of planning for anything more felt foreign. Frightening, even. I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze softening slightly. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time. For now, why don't you come back to the center with me? They could use the help, and it'll give you something to focus on." Leah hesitated. The day before had been both overwhelming and strangely rewarding. For the first time in years, she had felt a flicker of purpose, a reminder of the capable person she used to be. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to face those feelings again, to confront the gap between who she was and who she had become. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'll go." The Veterans Center buzzed with quiet activity when they arrived. Volunteers sorted donations in one corner, while a small group of veterans gathered around a table, chatting over coffee. Daniel guided Leah toward Sarah, the center's coordinator, who greeted them with a warm smile. "Back again so soon?" Sarah teased, her eyes sparkling with genuine kindness. "We must have made quite the impression." Leah offered a small smile, feeling a bit more at ease in Sarah's presence. I wanted to help." "Well, we're glad to have you," Sarah replied, gesturing toward a stack of clothing donations. "If you're up for it, we could use some help organizing those." Leah nodded and set to work, her hands busy as her mind settled into the rhythm of the task. As the hours passed, she found herself drawn into the center's atmosphere. The sense of camaraderie and shared resilience. It wasn't just a place of support. It was a place of belonging, something Leah hadn't felt in a very long time. During a break, Leah sat with a cup of tea, listening as an elderly veteran named Frank shared stories of his time in the Navy. His voice was gravelly, his anecdotes laced with humor and wisdom. She laughed at his jokes, surprised at how natural it felt to smile again. "You've got a good laugh," Frank said, his eyes twinkling. "Haven't heard one like that around here in a while." Leah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "I guess I forgot what it felt like to laugh." Frank leaned forward, his expression turning serious. You've been through something, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes. Leah hesitated, her instinct to deflect worrying with the growing sense of trust she felt in this place. Finally, she nodded. I lost everything. My husband, my home, my business. I've been trying to find my way back ever since. Frank nodded, his gaze understanding. You're not alone in that, you know. A lot of us here. We've lost pieces of ourselves along the way. But you're still standing. That counts for something. His words lingered with Leah for the rest of the day, echoing in her mind as she worked alongside the other volunteers. By the time she and Daniel returned to his home that evening, she felt a sense of quiet resolve blooming within her, a small but significant step forward. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Leah turned to Daniel. I've been thinking, she began hesitantly, about what you said, about finding a direction. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. What's on your mind? I used to have a bakery, Leah said, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. It wasn't just a business. It was a place where people came together. I lost it, but maybe I could find a way to rebuild. Not the bakery itself, but something like it. Something that helps people. Daniel's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. What are you thinking? Leah took a deep breath, the words forming with more clarity as she spoke them aloud. I've seen what you've built at the center, the way it gives people a sense of purpose. I want to do something like that. Maybe a community kitchen, or a place where people can learn skills to get back on their feet. Daniel smiled faintly, a rare warmth in his features. That's a good idea. You've got the heart for it. But I don't have the means, Leah admitted, her voice wavering. I don't even know where to start. Daniel's smile widened slightly. One step at a time, remember. You don't have to do it alone. Leah looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Why are you helping me, Daniel? You don't even know me. Daniel's gaze turned distant for a moment, as though he were looking at something far away. Because someone helped me once, he said quietly, when I didn't think I deserved it, and because I know what it's like to feel lost. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the unspoken understanding between them stronger than any words could convey. In that shared quiet, Leah felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The spark of purpose. The following days passed in a blur of quiet determination. Daniel had insisted on driving Leah to the library in town, a small but well-kept space nestled in the heart of the community. It was there, amidst the rows of books and the faint hum of computers, that Leah began her journey toward rebuilding her life. She spent hours at one of the library's old but reliable computers, scouring resources on grants, small business loans, and nonprofit organizations. Each discovery added a spark of hope to her burgeoning idea. A community center that offered more than just a meal or a place to rest. It would be a sanctuary, a training ground, and a hub for people to rediscover their potential. Daniel accompanied her on most of these trips, often settling into a corner chair with a book while Leah worked. Though he rarely said much, his quiet presence was a source of comfort. Occasionally, he would glance up from his book and catch her scribbling notes with a look of fierce concentration, a glimmer of the person she had once been shining through. One afternoon, as Leah gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Daniel spoke up. You're putting in the work, he said, his tone approving. But have you thought about where you'd start? A building, supplies, staff. It's going to take more than ideas. Leah hesitated, her enthusiasm momentarily dampened by the weight of his words. I know, she admitted. I've been trying to figure that out. I can't do this on my own, but I don't have the connections or the money to make it happen. Daniel stood, tucking his book under his arm. You're not as alone as you think, he said simply. Let's head back. I've got something to show you. When they arrived at Daniel's house, he led Leah to the spare room that he had once used for storage. Over the past week, she had helped him clear it out, turning the cluttered space into a modest but comfortable bedroom. Now it was transformed again. A large corkboard stood against the wall, covered with pinned documents, photos, and notes. "What is this?" Leah asked, her eyes scanning the board. "It's my project," Daniel said, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. "After I retired, I needed something to keep me grounded. Helping at the Veterans Center gave me purpose, but I wanted to do more. I started mapping out ideas, ways to create a space where people could rebuild their lives." Leah moved closer, studying the board. There were articles about successful community programs, photos of vacant buildings in town, and lists of resources for veterans and displaced individuals. "This is incredible," she murmured. "Why didn't you do it?" Daniel shrugged, his gaze distant. "I never got past the planning stage. It felt too big, too overwhelming. But seeing you work these past few days, I think it's time to stop sitting on the sidelines." Leah turned to him, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You want to do this together?" Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think we'd make a good team. You've got the vision, and I've got the connections. We can figure out the rest." For the first time in years, Leah felt a surge of genuine excitement. She nodded, her determination rekindled. "Let's do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Leah and Daniel spent hours refining their plan, combining their skills and experiences into a cohesive vision. They decided to call their project New Horizons, a name that reflected their shared belief in second chances. Leah's background in running a business proved invaluable. She created detailed budgets, outlined program structures, and drafted a proposal that could be presented to potential donors and partners. Meanwhile, Daniel reached out to his network, contacting old friends and colleagues who might be willing to help. His reputation as a respected veteran lent their project an air of credibility, opening doors that Leah couldn't have accessed on her own. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Sarah, the coordinator from the Veterans Center, offered to connect them with a local nonprofit organization. The organization, she explained, had been looking for new projects to support, particularly those aimed at helping vulnerable populations. The meeting with the nonprofit's board was nerve-wracking but ultimately successful. Leah presented their proposal with a confidence she hadn't realized she still possessed, while Daniel spoke passionately about their mission. By the end of the meeting, the board members were nodding in agreement. "We'll need to see more detailed plans," one of the board members said, "but we're very interested in supporting your project. This town could use something like New Horizons." As they left the meeting, Leah felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration. "We did it," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "We actually did it." Daniel smiled, his rare grin lighting up his face. "This is just the beginning." Their momentum continued to build. With the nonprofit's backing, they secured a small grant to cover initial expenses. It wasn't enough to fully fund their vision, but it was a start. They found a vacant building on the edge of town, a rundown but structurally sound space that seemed perfect for their needs. The renovation process was grueling but rewarding. Volunteers from the Veterans Center, along with a handful of community members, pitched in to clean, paint, and repair the building. Leah discovered a hidden talent for interior design, transforming the space into a warm and welcoming environment. Daniel, meanwhile, proved to be a skilled handyman, tackling repairs with the same precision he had once applied to military operations. As the building took shape, so did their programs. They decided to offer a mix of services, from job training and counseling to community meals and workshops. Leah's favorite addition was a small bakery kitchen, a nod to her past, and a way to teach practical skills. One evening, as Leah and Daniel stood outside the nearly finished building, watching the sunset, Leah turned to him. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted. "Like I have a purpose, like I'm part of something bigger than myself." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Me neither," he said quietly. "But here we are." Leah smiled, a feeling of gratitude washing over her. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, he replied, his tone firm. You just needed someone to remind you of what you're capable of. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in a warm golden glow, Leah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. New Horizons wasn't just a project. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the beauty of second chances. Rising tides. The grand opening of New Horizons was only days away, and the excitement in the air was palpable. The once abandoned building now stood as a beacon of hope, a blend of modern touches and warm, inviting decor that reflected Leah's vision and Daniel's pragmatism. The name New Horizons was proudly displayed on a hand-carved wooden sign above the entrance, a gift from a local artist who had been moved by their mission. Inside, volunteers worked tirelessly to put the finishing touches on each room. The bakery kitchen gleamed with polished countertops and neatly organized shelves, stocked with supplies donated by local businesses. The main hall was set up with tables and chairs for workshops, while smaller rooms had been outfitted for counseling sessions and private meetings. The space was alive with purpose. Leah stood in the kitchen, carefully arranging a tray of freshly baked bread. She had been practicing recipes for weeks, perfecting simple yet comforting dishes that she planned to serve during their community meals. Baking had always been her solace, and now it felt like a way to give back, a bridge between her past and the future she was building. Daniel entered, wiping his hands on a rag. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the faint scars of battles fought long ago. "Smells good in here," he remarked, leaning against the doorway. Leah looked up and smiled. "It's the bread. I'm trying a new recipe, something hearty but simple. Think people will like it." Daniel shrugged, but there was a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "If it tastes as good as it smells, they'll love it." Leah chuckled, the sound light and genuine. "High praise from you." As they shared a rare moment of levity, Sarah walked in, holding a clipboard. Her expression was bright but focused, the look of someone who thrived on organization. "All right, you two," she said, glancing between them. "I've got updates. The guest list for the opening is finalized, the media is confirmed, and the mayor's office sent over a statement of support. It's all coming together." Leah felt a surge of pride and nervous energy. "It still feels surreal," she admitted. "A month ago, this was just an idea. Now it's real." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's because of you and Daniel. You've both poured everything into this. The community sees that." Daniel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "We're not done yet. Plenty of work left before Saturday." "Always the taskmaster," Sarah teased before turning back to Leah. "Take a moment to enjoy this. You've earned it." The night before the opening, Leah found herself unable to sleep. She stood on the porch, staring out at the quiet street illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights. The sky was clear, a stark contrast to the stormy night that had brought her to Daniel's door. Her thoughts drifted back to that night and the weeks that followed. She had walked through his door as a broken woman, unsure if she had anything left to give. Now she felt stronger, more alive than she had in years. But beneath the excitement was a flicker of doubt. What if it wasn't enough? What if New Horizons failed to make the impact they hoped for? The sound of the screen door creaking open pulled her from her thoughts. Daniel stepped out, a blanket draped over one shoulder. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Leah shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Daniel joined her, leaning against the porch railing. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, he spoke. "You're thinking too much about the what-ifs. Don't." Leah glanced at him, surprised by his bluntness. "Easier said than done." "Maybe," he admitted, "but you've already done more than most people ever will. You took a chance. You built something. That matters." His words settled over her like a warm blanket, soothing the edges of her anxiety. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me." Daniel shrugged, but his gaze was steady. "You gave me something to believe in. Don't forget that." The day of the grand opening dawned bright and crisp, the autumn air filled with the mingling scents of leaves and freshly brewed coffee. Volunteers bustled around, making final preparations as guests began to arrive. The small parking lot filled quickly, and a buzz of excitement rippled through the crowd. Leah stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a mixture of nervous energy and genuine warmth. Many of the faces were familiar: volunteers from the Veteran Center, local business owners who had offered their support, and neighbors who had been curious about the project. But there were also strangers, drawn by word of mouth and curiosity. The ceremony began with a short speech from Sarah, who thanked everyone for their support and highlighted the mission of New Horizons. Then it was Leah's turn. She stepped up to the small podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges. "When I first started dreaming of this place," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I wasn't sure it could ever be more than that. A dream. I had lost so much, and the idea of rebuilding felt impossible. But sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to take a chance on you." Her gaze shifted to Daniel, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed. "For me, that person was Daniel. He didn't just give me shelter on a stormy night. He gave me hope. And together, we've built something that I hope will give others the same." The crowd erupted into applause as Leah stepped back, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Daniel gave her a small nod, his way of saying, "Well done." The ribbon was cut, and the doors to New Horizons officially opened. Guests streamed inside, exploring the space and marveling at the transformation. The bakery kitchen quickly became a favorite, with Leah serving samples of her bread and explaining the skills training programs they plan to offer. As the day progressed, Leah and Daniel moved through the crowd, answering questions and soaking in the energy of the event. There were moments of laughter, moments of quiet connection, and moments of realization that what they had built was more than just a building. It was a community. That evening, after the last guests had left and the volunteers had gone home, Leah and Daniel sat together in the main hall, surrounded by the remnants of the day's festivities. The room was quiet now, but it still hummed with the echoes of laughter and hope. "We did it," Leah said, her voice soft but filled with awe. "It's real." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it is." Leah turned to him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You just needed someone to remind you what you're capable of." As they sat together in the quiet of their shared accomplishment, Leah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. New Horizons was more than just a second chance for her. It was the beginning of something greater. A legacy of hope. The days following the grand opening of New Horizons were a blur of activity. The buzz generated by the event had exceeded Leah and Daniel's expectations, bringing a steady stream of visitors eager to see what the center was all about. Volunteers worked tirelessly, programs filled quickly, and the hum of life in the building grew stronger with each passing day. For Leah, every moment was a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She found herself juggling multiple roles: baker, organizer, mentor, and occasional counselor. The bakery kitchen became her sanctuary, a place where she could reconnect with her passion while teaching others practical skills. Watching people who had once been hesitant gain confidence as they learned to knead dough or decorate a cake was more rewarding than she could have imagined. Daniel, meanwhile, thrived in his role as the center's quiet backbone. His years of leadership in the military translated seamlessly into managing the center's logistics. Whether it was coordinating schedules, overseeing repairs, or offering a listening ear to veterans who stopped by, he approached each task with the same calm efficiency. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the center's courtyard, Leah and Daniel stood together, surveying the bustling scene. A group of teenagers worked on a community garden project in one corner, while a class on resume writing was underway in one of the meeting rooms. The air was alive with the sounds of laughter and conversation. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Leah said, her voice filled with awe. "To see it all coming together like this." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady as he watched a young man show a veteran how to plant seedlings. "Yeah, it's good." Leah smiled, used to his understated way of expressing himself. "Good doesn't even begin to cover it," she teased gently. "This place is changing lives." Daniel glanced at her, his expression softening. "Yours included." Leah's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of quiet gratitude. "You're right. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, like I had something to give, something to fight for." "I owe that to you." Daniel shook his head. "You owe it to yourself. You're the one who made this happen." Leah opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of someone calling her name interrupted the moment. She turned to see Sarah approaching, her clipboard in hand as always. "Leah, Daniel," Sarah said, her excitement evident. "I just got off the phone with the regional nonprofit board. They've been hearing about what we're doing here, and they want to meet with us to discuss expanding the concept to other towns." Leah's eyes widened. "Expanding?" Sarah nodded. "They think New Horizons could be a model for other communities. They're even talking about additional funding to help us develop the framework." Leah glanced at Daniel, her mind racing. The thought of expanding their work was thrilling, but it was also daunting. "That's huge," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and uncertainty. "It is," Sarah agreed, "but it's a testament to what you've built here. People see the impact, and they want to be part of it." Daniel crossed his arms, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's a big step. We'd need to make sure we're ready before committing to something like that." "Of course," Sarah said quickly. "They're not expecting an answer right away. Take some time to think it over." After Sarah left, Leah turned to Daniel, her thoughts swirling. "What do you think?" she asked. "Is it too much?" Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "It's a lot," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's too much. We've already done what most people would think is impossible. It's just the next challenge." Leah nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "We'll figure it out. Together." Over the next few weeks, Leah and Daniel worked to refine their vision for New Horizons. They developed detailed plans for potential expansion, drawing on their experiences to identify what worked and what could be improved. The process was both exhausting and invigorating, pushing them to think bigger while staying grounded in their original mission. During this time, the center continued to thrive. Leah grew particularly close to a young woman named Maria, who had joined the bakery program after losing her job during the pandemic. At first, Maria had been shy and withdrawn, her self-esteem battered by months of unemployment. But as Leah taught her the art of baking, Maria began to blossom. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the kitchen, Maria spoke up. "I don't know how to thank you, Ms. Leah," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "This program, it's given me more than just skills. It's given me hope." Leah paused, her hands covered in flour, and looked at Maria. "You don't have to thank me," she said gently. "You're the one putting in the effort. I'm just giving you the tools." Maria smiled, her confidence shining through for the first time. "Still, I wouldn't be here without you." The exchange stayed with Leah long after Maria left for the day. It was a reminder of why she had started this journey in the first place, not just to rebuild her own life, but to help others do the same. As the first snow of the season dusted the town in white, Leah and Daniel received word that the nonprofit board had approved their expansion plan. The news was met with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. There were countless details to sort out, from identifying new locations to training staff and securing funding. One evening, as they sat in the now familiar quiet of Daniel's porch, Leah voiced her concerns. "What if we're taking on more than we can handle?" she asked, her breath visible in the chilly air. Daniel sipped his coffee, his gaze steady. "We've handled everything so far," he said simply. "This is no different." Leah smiled faintly, drawing strength from his calm confidence. "I guess you're right. I don't want to lose what makes New Horizons special." "You won't," Daniel assured her, "because you won't let it happen." His words, as always, had a way of cutting through her doubts. Leah nodded, her resolve solidifying once more. Together, they would rise to the challenge, just as they always had. Months turned into years, and New Horizons grew beyond their wildest dreams. The center became a model for other communities, with locations springing up across the region. Each one carried the same spirit of resilience and compassion that Leah and Daniel had infused into the original. Through it all, Leah and Daniel remained at the heart of the movement, their bond unshakable. They had started as strangers brought together by a storm, but they had become partners, friends, and, in many ways, a family. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly hold more challenges, they faced it with the quiet strength of two people who had found their purpose, not just in rebuilding their own lives, but in helping others do the same. Together, they had created a legacy of hope,